Science Uncut, presented by the Volkswagen Foundation.
Paul Collier is Professor of Economics and Public Policy and Director of the Center for the Study of African Economies at the University of Oxford. He has worked for the World Bank, he has been named one of the top global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine, and was awarded knighthood by the British Queen in 2014 for promoting research and policy change in Africa. The main focus of his work is on poverty, inequality, and democracy in Africa. He is best known for his book, The Bottom Billion. In it, he describes the reasons why the poorest countries in the world have failed to make progress. In his talk for the Volkswagen Foundation, Collier gives one central and provocative argument for why the extremely poor stay poor. Democracy, he says, fails to counter the forces of inequality. According to Collier, democracy is by nature a divisive power and does not produce the identities, narratives, and norms that are necessary to create more equality. Mass national parties, on the other hand, like, for example, the South African ANC, are, in his opinion, far better at building common identities. Collier was one of the keynote speakers at the Herrenhausen conference Rethinking Social Inequality, organized by the Volkswagen Foundation. The conference took place in Hanover from May 12th to 14th of 2014. The title of Paul Collier's talk is Democracy and Social Equity, Potential Tensions.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me. There have been two very important new books on social inequality just out in the last few months. And I rather assume most of you haven't read them yet. So let me start with them, because what they show is that there are fundamental forces that are actually very worrying from a perspective of social equity. And the first one, which is already pretty famous, you can't have missed reading about it, even if you've not read it yet, is the Piketty book on capital. And what that argues and shows is that capital builds up relative to income, so that in the long run you get a very large amount of capital relative to income, and capital is very much more concentrated in ownership than income, and so that is a force leading to greater social inequality. The triumph of the book, and it is a triumph, is to build very long historical time series of a couple of hundred years for quite a few countries. And that puts the 20th century in perspective, because what he shows is that essentially the generation that I grew up with lived through very peculiar times, post-war times. What he shows is that the wars, the two world wars, had devastating effects on capital, so that capital fell very sharply relative to income, and has then had a long 50-year, 60-year period of recovery, which is still not finished. So the next couple of decades, he forecasts still further accumulation of capital relative to income. So my generation grew up in an age when the distribution of income was not dominated by the ownership of wealth. And his point is that's really unusual. My generation misinterpreted that. We thought, oh, this is the new world. This is the new world of democracy. The social equity of the 1960s and 70s was nothing to do with democracy. It was a legacy of war. Right? The same was true of the 1920s, when capital was devastated by the First World War. And so you get two massive shocks depressing capital relative to income. Right? And that's peculiar. Right? The 21st century is going to revert. 21st century is not going to be a century of war. Right? 21st century is going to revert to the domination of capital over income and a highly concentrated ownership. So that's Piketty. It's an immensely important book. You kind of miss the reviews, but it's actually worth reading. It's a very long book, but it's really very good. And it's well written. The other book, which absolutely complements Piketty, and they've not been put together. I've not seen any comment which has linked the two. But the other book is by a guy called Gregory Clark, called The Sun Also Rises. But sun is S-O-N, right? The son of the father, not the sun in the sky. Right? And The Sun Also Rises is a microeconomic book about inequality. So Piketty is a macroeconomic book about the stock of capital in an economy relative to the flow of income. What Gregory Clark's book is about is he looks at the extent of social mobility between generations. And he uses a brilliant technique for doing it, which is rare surnames. And so he traces rare surnames for many generations. And what he shows, devastatingly, is that if you take a rare surname that starts at the top end of the social scale, it stays at the top of the social scale, generation after generation after generation. There is very much less social mobility than we had believed. And he shows why social scientists have greatly exaggerated social mobility. Very convincingly. The most amazing thing about Gregory Clark's book is that he takes around 10 examples from around the world and traces this extent of intergenerational mobility, or the lack of it, across many generations. And he finds that you get the same very low level of social mobility across utterly different political and social landscapes. You can go through massive social upheavals, and it makes no difference. So the degree of social immobility in China through the period of the Chinese Revolution, Cultural Revolution and everything, is the same as in modern America, which is the same as Sweden over the last 70 years, same as France, same as medieval Britain. An astonishing set of results. Very low social mobility. Now, one message of that is, as it were, don't look to the political kingdom or even the social kingdom to achieve social mobility. It's just not achievable. And Clark's final message is what is achievable is squashing up the income differences. That you can't stop the sons doing as well as the fathers, or the daughters doing as well as the mothers. But what you can do is reduce the gap between the top and the bottom. So the rank ordering is pretty well impervious to what you do. But the gap between the top ranks and the bottom ranks, that can be squashed up. Now, where they fit together is not only macro-micro, but Piketty's focus is basically on capital. For Piketty, that is the mechanism which is generating inequality. Whereas for Clark, the mechanism is not capital. It's human capital. It's something within people that's passed on person to person, which isn't wealth. Right? Could be culture, could be genetics, whatever. Right? It's most powerful where you get endogamy. That is where the group only marries within the group. And then you get some social groups at the bottom which only marry each other and they stay at the bottom. And some social groups at the top which only marry each other and they stay at the top. Not just for a few generations, but for centuries. And there's recent sociological work. A guy called Murray has done a study of America called Coming Apart, where basically the thesis is you're getting more powerfully assortative mating. That is more powerful endogamy, that within the people marry within the group, and that the marriage within the group is increasingly sorted by human capital. So the clever marry the clever. And that will produce a yet more powerful intergenerational transmission of inequality. So to the extent that the clever marry the clever, that reinforces what Clark has already found, the lack of mobility between generations. And of course, universities are, amongst other things, devices for assortative mating on the basis of intellectual ability. You put part of the clever part of your population together at just the age where they're looking for mates, and they marry each other. So universities are, in fact, very powerful forces for the perpetuation of social inequality, unfortunately. So that's the first building block. The objective forces for inequality are really very disturbing. The second feature is to bring in the politics, and all my adult life I've been a sort of pro-democracy advocate, I suppose, and I've become pretty disillusioned. Democracy very often fails to counter these forces of inequality. Basically, the median voter process by which parties are supposed to deliver things that benefit the median voter just doesn't work very well at all. If we look around the world, the United States, it's pretty clear what's happened there. You know, the Tea Party movement is an example of that, where poor people are voting against their own self-interest. And it's clear that what's happened there is the power of wealth has captured the media that those people read and listen to. If we take Africa, which is the region I've sort of worked on most, what democracy has tended to produce is ethnic voting. So you can predict voting very closely on ethnic lines rather than economic performance. And very, very weak checks and balances, so that you've got contestation at election time, but then whoever wins can basically do what they like. So there are rules about the acquisition of power, but not about the use of power. There's some benefits from democracy in Africa, but I think not that much. There's some new work coming out showing that one of the benefits is that, and it's a study of Kenya, showing that during the democratic phases in Kenya, you get more equal treatment between ethnic groups. But that's about it. Right? So the politics in Kenya is about ethnic voting blocks, and democracy forces a certain degree of equity between the ethnic voting blocks, but not within them. Or we take the Eurozone, where we've got a very powerful mechanism working for social inequality within the Eurozone, which is called the euro. And if you look at the last 6 or 7 years, the massive divergence in unemployment rates across Europe. Youth unemployment. Right? Young people in Germany are in work. Young people in Southern Europe are out of work to an astonishing degree. You've got youth unemployment rates over 40%. For the average of Southern Europe, over 40%. Right? Now, it's quite clear what's produced that. Any economist who's not an idiot can tell you, right, that it's having a common currency with zero inflation. Right? That will condemn Southern Europe to heavy unemployment for a couple of decades. Right? And that's what you built. But there is no force in Europe to undo that. The euro, which has killed Southern European youth, is very popular in Southern Europe. Utter failure to connect between the problem and the cause. Democracy just hasn't delivered understanding. And that, I think, is pretty common. In sort of sophisticated political science is now, if you like, a sort of something of a pushback against certainly the emphasis on elections. So if you take Tim Besley, who I think is the most sophisticated commentator in the world on this stuff at the moment, he actually says, well, we should abandon the distinction between democracy and other things, that's not where the action is. What matters is not the process by which power is acquired, it's the process by which power is used. It's checks and balances on the use of power. And I agree with that, but I want to be one step more radical and discuss what are the real checks and balances. And because of the work of Acemoglu and Robinson, we very much tend to think that everything's about institutions. And I've come to the view relatively recently that it isn't institutions, and that beneath institutions what really matters is beliefs, so that you can get the things that look like the same institutions in different societies, but function very differently depending upon what the beliefs of the population are. Now, what do I mean by beliefs? I mean three things. Beliefs in identity, beliefs in narratives, and beliefs in norms. So what I'm going to say now is about identities, narratives, and norms. These are sort of building blocks from social psychology, not from economics. Though economists are just moving into the idea that identity matters. There's a brilliant book by Nobel laureate in economics, George Akerlof, called Identity Economics. New book, strongly recommended. I think identities matter for inequality because a sense of shared identity produces what I call mutual regard and what Adam Smith called empathy, basically. So shared identity helps to build more equitable societies because people recognize that if they're high income, it's partly because of luck, and people who are low income, it's partly because of bad luck. And so the people who are at the top see themselves as part of the same process which produces good and bad fortune, are willing to share. They care about other people in the society. That's mutual regard. If you start with a shared sense of identity, then democracy can function very well. That's the sort of Scandinavian story, I think. But democracy cannot build shared identity in a society which doesn't start with it. And there's a very simple reason for that, which is that democracy, by its nature, is a divisive process. Democracy is about multi-party competition, us versus them. Everything in democracy is sort of polarized. It's a competition for political power. And so what it doesn't produce is a narrative of shared identity. It's oppositional interests. And what we've seen in recent years with democracy, I think, certainly in the societies I work on most, is fragmentation produced by democracy. So democracy produces division. If I turn from identity to narratives, let me focus on one particular pair of narratives which are alternatives and which are really important in whether you get social equity or not. And that is whether rent-seeking is understood for what it is. Rent-seeking is the building of privilege, privileged access. What rent seekers are doing is creating conditions in which they can be better off at the expense of others. Right? Rents are an economic term about a transfer between A and B. B's better off, A's worse off. That's rents. Right? And a lot of activity. There's been a huge growth in OECD societies in rent-seeking activities in recent years. And the mechanism which has produced that is actually democratic. Because the lobbies which benefit from rent-seeking are able to lobby the political process to create the privilege. And the narrative they use to do that is obviously not a narrative which says, what I want is privilege so that I can plunder somebody else's income. The narrative that is used is a pro-business narrative. Rent seekers are not productive businesses, they're the opposite of it. They're parasitic on productive business, but they dress their activities up in pro-business language. So a good example would be a lot of the financial and legal sector in America. There's a very good example in yesterday's Financial Times, a $32 billion heist by the finance vulture funds, hedge funds, to try and get privileged access to the fallout from mortgages. So that's described in a major article in the Financial Times yesterday, $32 billion heist. And the lobbying industry in America has grown enormously in the last 3 decades. Just lobbying in Congress is now an industry which is over $3 billion a year. So that's an example of where a mistaken narrative is used to create an awful lot of social inequality. So identities, narratives. Identities are how people see others. Narratives are how people understand the world works or misunderstand how the world works. And norms are the internalized constraints that people navigate by. What is acceptable, what is unacceptable? And we're seeing a new norm develop, which is the norm of libertarianism, which is much more prevalent in America than in Europe, but is enormously powerful now in America. And libertarianism is built on the language of rights and freedoms, and you can juxtapose it against the language of solidarity. So libertarianism essentially is undermining the ability of social groups to, for example, organize to get taxation. The libertarian norm is saying, no, I have a right to whatever I earn, I've got freedom to do what I want, and so freedom and rights is the new normative narrative which produces, I believe, a lot of inequality. Finally, where do all these identities, narratives, and norms come from? Well, they're delivered through networks. And here what I want to argue is something really quite radical, which is that in a lot of poor societies, especially societies which don't start from shared identity, which don't start from very functional narratives, and don't have good norms that were conducive to equity, to equality, then the right vehicles for building these functional beliefs may well be mass national parties rather than democratic contestation. If I give you an example of a mass national party, it will be the ANC in South Africa. We describe South Africa as a democracy because it's, in some sense, contestation. But of course, the ANC has never been in any danger of losing power. It'll be a quarter century at least of ANC unqualified power. And we can look to see the same thing elsewhere in the world. Sweden, for nearly half a century, from the 1930s to the 1980s, it's called a democracy, but the same party was in power right through. Singapore, one party the entire time. Well, is Singapore a democracy? Well, we don't really know, right? China, well, it's pretty clear it wouldn't tick the democracy box, one party, but a national mass party. Ethiopia, Rwanda, both the same, mass national parties. Ethiopia has built a party of 5 million people. Is Ethiopia a democracy? No. Right? But what these mass parties do, from the ANC right through, whether or not formally it's a democracy or not, what they do is build common identity. You know, you're all South African, you're all Ethiopian, whatever. So common identity. And then a narrative. What are we doing? We're building the country. We're trying to build an inclusive country. Right? And a set of norms, which is the opposite of division. They're norms of unity. Of course, mass parties don't have to be like that, but they can be like that, and they often are like that. And if we look for the successes in poor countries that actually build inclusive growth, well, China's done a lot better than India. India's democracy, China is not a democracy, but it is a mass national party with these norms, good norms of inclusion, good narrative of development, and a shared identity. If we looked in Africa, the successful countries, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Botswana, ANC, Botswana and South Africa tick the boxes of democracy, but there's never actually been a transfer of power. Ethiopia and Rwanda don't even tick the boxes. But ticking the boxes doesn't matter very much. They've all done well, relative to any reasonable counterfactual. They've certainly done better than the democracies where power has transferred, Sierra Leone, Zambia. Or if we look from the 1930s to the 1980s, the US versus Sweden, which was the more democratic? I think it's very reasonable to argue that the US was much more, in practice, democratic because you got alternation of political power between parties. Sweden, you didn't. Which was the more equitable society? Undoubtedly Sweden. So, it's a plea to think beyond the battle for democracy. It's a plea to think of the battle for ideas, for identities, narratives, and norms that matter, delivered through social networks and mass political parties, mass national parties, as being sometimes really rather functional networks that deliver these messages. Let me close with some remarks about the battle for ideas. And that's the battle that we're in. And we sort of imagine, I certainly used to imagine, that democracy, in a way, automatically had advantages in winning the battle for ideas. And now I really question that. There's a very telling phrase, the truth is just another special interest. And that's the bitter reality, right? That in the battle for ideas, that what wins is not the truth, it's skilled communications, which may be on the side of truth, may not. Democratic societies are in a sense at a disadvantage because power is decided by the mass of people, and so for the truth to win, it has to reach everybody, or at least it has to reach a majority of the population, and the majority of the population are really not very interested in political struggle. And so the majority of the population are actually very easy to fool. You can't fool all the people all the time, but quite often you can fool a majority. Right? And so we, of course, eventually you get to the happy land of mature democracies where enough of the population understands up from down. But getting there is a very messy journey. And I think in our enthusiasm for just saying democracy everywhere, we've underestimated the difficulty of that journey. We've underestimated the difficulty of building a society with functional identities, functional narratives, understanding of the world, functional norms. Building those functional beliefs is a hard struggle, and it's not necessarily a struggle in which democracy is the best suited vehicle for achieving it. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for this really provoking and exciting talk that we've just heard. Is there a need to talk right now for, I would take one or two questions to Mr. Collier if anyone wants to ask right away.
Hello, I'm TK Kreisig. I have a background in culture, and you were focusing a lot on the effect that political parties can have on building identity. And have you any ideas about cultural identities rather than political identities or religious identities in the process of identity forming?
Okay, I think I'd take the second question right away. And
yes. My question was also about the identity question, because what you are telling us that you can build good inclusive societies, so forces that keep societies together. But what happens between societies? And that is my worry, because that goes in the direction of identity politics. I mean, I can imagine that we can construct inclusive societies with norms, identities, and narratives, but they can be mutually exclusive between societies, and isn't that a huge risk?
Yeah, let me take the second one first. Of course, the key way in which common identity was built within societies was international warfare. I mean, that's historically been the way that cohesive identities got built, undoubtedly. Right? It's not the only way. And if we look in Africa, a triumph of President Nyerere of Tanzania was to build common identity without international aggression. And he did it through techniques of, first of all, a constant narrative, you're all Tanzanians. Secondly, by techniques of a common language, Kiswahili. Third, by techniques of a common education curriculum. Fourth, by techniques of when young people were recruited into the civil service, he'd move them. They weren't allowed to work in their own region. They had to work in another region. So they had to start to think of themselves as Tanzanians. rather than chaga or whatever. Right? And very good social science research showed that over a period of about 40 years, that really did make a difference. There's a very good comparison with Kenya, where you got ethnic politics for 40 years. And basically, Tanzanians learned to cooperate across ethnic boundaries, and Kenyans didn't. And that's there in the social science data. So there are other ways of forming national identity than warfare. Am I very worried that, that if we get cohesive societies, we'll get a return to war? No. If you look at I do quite a lot of work on conflict, and basically international violent conflict has almost disappeared. Right? It's negligible now, and it's been a long process of decline. Within Europe, and Germans especially, and since I'm in Germany, let me say this, Chancellor Merkel has been giving a message that it's either the euro or war. And if you switch your brain on for a moment, that's obviously nonsense. Right? Is Germany... Right, let's try this. Right? During the period of violence, Germany invaded Poland and it invaded Norway. Right? Well, Poland got the euro and it's part of the European community. Norway is not part of the euro, it's not part of the European community. Is Germany any more likely to invade Norway than it is to invade Poland? Right? Obviously, you're never going to invade anybody ever again. Right? The European community and the euro are responses to changes of attitudes. They're not the cause of peace. Right? And so this chimera of the danger of a return to international warfare, it's worth a thought, but we cannot drive policy off that. Social cohesion, a sense of shared identity, is really valuable, in my view. It produces cooperation, it produces generosity, it produces trust. These things are really materially valuable, especially for poor people. And if we're going to use some chimera of the fear of a return to the conditions of the Second World War to prevent ourselves doing that, we sacrifice an awful lot for an illusion. Cultural identities. Clearly part of building a common identity is a common culture. It's not the only thing in a common identity, but it helps. You know? I'm skeptical of the whole sort of multicultural mantra. I think it's part of this sort of libertarian individualistic approach. Let everybody have their own culture, let everybody do their own thing. We pay a big price if we build a society of individuals. And the people who really pay the price in a society of individuals are the poorest. Just look at America, where America is the triumph of individualism. And for the last 40 years, never mind the poor, the person on median income, the middle of the social hierarchy in America, for 40 years, their real income has been stagnant. So the phenomenal growth in America the last 40 years, none of it has benefited the median voter. None of it. So much for democracy benefiting everybody through the median voter theorem. It just doesn't work. And America, over the last 40 years, is the devastating evidence which substantiates that. Thanks.